in bush. I've got him at gunpoint.
Okay, gunpoint 132 in bush. Coverage code 3.
Welcome to Roll Call with the Richmond, Indiana Police Department. I'm your host, Pat Tudor. I'm a detective with the Richmond Police Department. Today's podcast is going to be from case to court. We've got our some of our detectives with our investigative services with us here today. Do a quick recap. Episode 1, we had our administrative services in talking about overview and the structure of the agency. Episode 2, we talked to Lieutenant Lips, who was the commander of our patrol division. We had some of our patrol supervisors and officers with us that day. Today, we're going to take a little bit more in-depth, look at what we do as an agency when it comes to our investigative services. A couple things I do want to kind of point out too. May 16th of this year, we are hosting the Sierra Legacy Canine Trials. I'd like for, give an invitation to the community to come out and support that event. Our agency and everybody that's involved with that, with Amy Miller and our canine handlers and Jai, they do a great job of putting this event on, primarily, to continue to have Sierra's legacy continue within our community, and also to give our canine handlers the opportunity to go out and to showcase their dogs and their skills as individuals and as officers. It's a great opportunity. Again, if you love the dogs, it's a good chance to come out and watch them perform. It's a big event. It's on a Saturday at the Wayne County Fairgrounds. It's an all-day event. They've got food. They've got apparel that you can buy. And again, just come out and support the officers who are there, because we really get officers from all over the area. I think last time we had some officers that drove 8 or 10 hours. So again, that's going to be Saturday, May 16th, 2026 at the Wayne County Fairgrounds. So, guys, I'll introduce you to Podcast 3. We appreciate you being here. I'll probably start down at the far end with Captain Jury, have you guys just kind of give a little bit of introduction, who you are, how long you've been on the agency, and kind of what your role and responsibility is. If there's maybe certain cases that you typically investigate, maybe kind of even, highlight that a little bit.
Captain Andrew Jury. I'm a commander currently of the Investigative Services Division. I've been with the Richmond Police Department for 24, going on 25 years.
Zach Huskisson. I've been with the agency for about 9 years, been in Investigative Services Division for about a year, and I've investigated anything from theft to shooting, so I've kind of covered it all in my time back there.
Detective Tom Legear. I've been with the department 41 years. I've been in detectives for 26. I mainly work majority of the major cases, as well as just general investigations as well.
And you're the senior man currently on the agency, right?
Yes.
41 years.
41.
Does it seem like 41?
No, actually, it's gone fairly fast.
Yeah.
Over the years.
Well, and again, and I mentioned this in one of the previous podcasts, and I don't make Tom blush, but Tom, you've been a workhorse. I mean, definitely, we guys that have worked with you for a long time, again, we know that when you retire and leave, which I think you got a date coming up.
Yeah, May of 27.
Yeah. Big shoes to fill. I know that these younger investigators probably going to have to take on some different and more responsibilities, because again, and we can talk about this once we get past the kind of introduction, but you primarily done a lot of the homicide, investigations over the last at least 10 years, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
And we'll talk about that here in a minute.
Detective Neil Van Middlesworth. I've been with the department for 28 years, been an investigator for about 8 years, and I mostly crimes against people, domestic violence type things, crimes against children, that kind of thing.
I'm Detective Paul Hutchison. I have been a police officer for over 9 years. I've been a detective for over 3 years. I got certified as crime scene investigator a couple years ago. I've done crime scene reconstruction, stuff like that as well. I investigate kind of all cases as well. I've done homicides, robberies, things like that, stabbings, shootings. Done some things with some children as well. So.
And we can dive into that a little bit more about how when we have those major crimes that kind of occur, that it's kind of what we call an all skate.
Right.
Typically, everybody's either called out for it or, everybody has some level of involvement if it's a big investigation. Some of the smaller ones, say maybe a theft from a retailer or something like that, it's typically just, assigned to you guys or whoever, and you just kind of follow that stuff up again. And today's not all of our investigators. This is maybe close to about half of what we have. Obviously, we kind of limited on the seating. So I guess let's just start with you, Captain Jury, if you don't mind. Just kind of take us through, when we respond to a call and there's a crime that's been committed, if an arrest is made at that time, typically our patrol officers will effect that arrest. But if it's something that requires some level of investigation or follow-up, just kind of walk us through that. Once that report's taken, what happens after that?
Okay, like you said before, patrol is the initial responding entity of the police department. If they make an arrest or if they resolve the situation, most times the investigation ends there. But if there's follow-up work to be done, such as search warrants on phones or DNA collection or something like that, maybe involving a domestic violence dispute, and they aren't able to obtain that at the time, we'll follow up on that. There's two main ways that cases get funneled to us for assignment. The most common way is reading and reviewing the reports. The Investigative Services Division is responsible for case management. That means every case that comes through, either myself or my number two, Lieutenant Mike Britt, reviews that case, determines if there's any solvability factors, and then it'll get assigned to a detective from that point. The other avenue in which we not respond, but receive cases is if we get called out on a violent or an ongoing criminal investigation that requires the additional services of our investigators.
Yeah, I know one thing that I think you and I, Captain Jury, talked a little bit about yesterday, and I think it's important for the community to know that, especially anytime you're serving, I think, in law enforcement and you're in a specialized division, say investigative services, you're on call 24/7. And I know that that's probably happened to all of us at some point, even if you're off a week's vacation, but you still happen to be in Richmond and it's a major crime occurs. Let's say we have a homicide or something. I'm sure we've all got that phone call at 2 a.m. on vacation, say, hey, are you, available to come in because, we need the resources and the manpower. And that's a big commitment, I think as a husband, as a father and things of that nature to, have those commitments that constantly, you're on call 24/7, pretty much 365 days a week, that you get that phone call at 2 a.m. and you got to come in. I mean, I'm sure Tom with, 41 years on, and how long have you been back in detectives?
26.
Yeah. I mean, I can only imagine how many times you've got those phone calls that, it always seems like we joke. It's, it's always at home when you're in bed.
Yeah, crimes always happen at 3 a.m. for some reason.
Yeah. But how many times we get those phone calls and you have to go out, and again, I think it's a big commitment, and again, it's something that I think as an agency, we got to have people who are dedicated to the job, to lay down whatever they're doing. And, and I can even remember, Neil and I one time were camping years and years and years ago up in Knightstown with retired officer Kurt Leverton. And we were actually on the SWAT team. And again, that's another specialized unit. And we had that shooting at the restaurant, at the Chinese restaurant in downtown. And yeah, Tom remembers that. He was here. And we had to drive back from Knightstown that night and, suit up to go in and that. So, it's a big commitment, when you take on, this job and those additional responsibilities to know that, you're on call, pretty much 24/7. So,
If I can add on to that.
yeah.
A lot of times when I receive these calls, either from the patrol commander or from the supervisors themselves, our detectives are off duty. These guys are amazing with their dedication to the job. A lot of times, they'll be out doing events with family members or participating in events with their kids, such as coaching or, whatever type of game they might be participating in. And they are amazing at adjusting their schedule, aligning for them to be able to respond to these investigations when they're needed.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's definitely a sacrifice. I know there's been times where Tom's maybe been in town for dinner, and you'll have somebody drop you off at the building, just to get there as quickly as we can. But so let's just kind of continue that conversation moving forward a little bit. So after those case reports are reviewed by either yourself or Lieutenant Brett, they will get assigned to a detective for follow-up if there's, well, as you said, some level of solvability, because we know sometimes some of the cases that we get, the solvability might be very low. And again, depending on the type of case it is, if it's something that's serious in nature, even if the solvability is low, I'd like to say it still is going to get assigned for follow-up. But, sometimes if we know that we just don't have a lot to go on, it can kind of, I don't want to say it gets necessarily closed, but it can set on the back burner maybe until something else gets, brought up, that we could use to investigate. But so when you guys make case assignments, I guess, how do you look at, and who do those cases, how's that determined who gets that case?
For case management, we try to assign the cases based on the detective's preference. For example, I'm going to use Neil as the guinea pig here. He prefers to work, and he's good at it. It's his forte, the juvenile cases. And we try to accommodate him with those. But there are times we have ups and downs with certain crimes. And if we're getting overloaded with juvenile crimes, then the rest of the division knows that it's going to spill out to them, and they're going to have to work these cases as well. It's a good thing and a bad thing to assign these cases solely to one detective because they don't get the other experience of working the other cases. But with our division being as small as it is, we can't dedicate a detective to a specialty field to work that and that only. Our investigators have to be able to work every type of investigation, be able to be efficient and knowledgeable in order to bring these cases to prosecution.
Yeah, and I know that, say, for example, our safe units, which we're going to have them on, I think maybe either our next episode or the episode after, but they can focus a little bit more, say, on a narcotics investigation. So they even a little bit more specific. But, maybe, Neil, a little bit talk about, and again, I know that from an agency and a community and a victim standpoint, it's good to kind of have, as Captain Drew was saying, somebody that understands that process and what it takes to not only navigate the investigation, but I'm sure you've got other services that you've built relationships with, say DCS, within the community, that it makes it easy when you are kind of the lead on those type of cases.
So I think that's one of the most valuable attributes that you develop. I think every investigator does it, which is you develop a network of people and who are resources, who you depend on, who are able to provide information, and you're able to give information between the two. And I think that's where I'm at now, understanding, evidence collection for crimes against children. A lot of the evidence is testimonial, and so protecting that and understanding how hearsay affects children and how all these things may impugn the testimony of the kids, and how by the time that gets to court, how that affects the case. So between understanding the processes of those, understanding how to work with officers on the street on collecting evidence related to children in the right way, as well as the other agents, DCS, probation, the JC House, the advocacy centers locally. So you just get used to that, and all those people are on your contact list that you can call at any time.
So back to you, I guess, Captain Jury, what would you say when these case assignments are made? And again, it's probably a little bit of navigating how many cases detectives have, because, obviously, like, say, if it's Detective Legear that's doing, say, major crimes, homicides, things of that nature, he may not carry the same volume or number of cases, obviously, because those types of investigations just are a lot more in depth, take a lot more time. But when those case assignments, I guess, are made, I mean, what would you guys say is the average number of cases that you may be at any given time investigating?
Yeah, it ranges, like you said. I may have 3, 4, 5 cases at a time.
Not given to you necessarily,
right, but
that you're actively
working. And some things take longer. So if you're waiting on search warrants for phones, or if you're waiting for video footage or things like that, you may kind of be at a standstill on this case because it's a waiting game where you're actually working a different case where things are kind of moving more fluidly.
Detective, you mean it's not like the TV shows where they get
yeah.
crimes
So
solved
yeah,
in
you
24
don't
hours.
solve your crime in 45 minutes with commercial breaks. It takes a long time, and that's something I don't think a lot of people realize. And I work the CSI stuff too, so there's a thing that the TV shows have brought into real life that affects court too. It's called the CSI effect, where people think that there's DNA over everything. They think there's blood there. If I take a fingerprint on somebody, we'll get results on that in a day. Where in real life it takes us a year to get results.
Yeah, and talk about fingerprints, and it's funny in Detective Legear, you can probably talk a little bit about this. I mean, DNA, was that a thing back when you started in detectives?
No,
Yeah.
it developed during the time I was been back there.
Yeah. So
when
go
it
ahead.
first developed, we were waiting a couple of years for any kind of results, and now we're still waiting almost a year because it's so overwhelming to the Indiana State Police Lab because everybody's sending DNA evidence to them.
Yeah, and we can't obviously control that timeline.
Right.
Once we collect the DNA and we send it to the lab for examination. If it's a major crime, maybe we can ask them to kind of expedite it. But that's probably every agency across the state having major crimes that hey, we also need to get this done. So. And again, I think you did a good job of just explaining that you really have to be able to multitask your investigations. And, one thing that we talk about too, and again, we've all worked in patrol, but there's this transition that when you're in patrol, you kind of see what the normal patrol work looks like. And then when you get into detectives and you're kind of shaking your head because, I know you're the newest detective or one of the newer detectives back there, you kind of see a different thing. When
Right.
you're in patrol and you get, say, a week's vacation, you kind of come back to clean slate. You don't leave anything pending. You come back as a detective and you could have a couple new cases on your desk. That work can compile if you are not actively, working those investigations. Right. And you can even probably, how was that transition, I guess, from patrol when you made it into detectives?
Yeah, it's definitely something that you gain a lot of new perspective on once you're back there. The time it takes, how extensive some of the investigations are. If you have a vacation coming up and you're working something, you're trying to get all of these things taken care of before you go on vacation to preserve evidence. And then you come back and you have to pick up where you left off, or like you said, you've got more cases to work now. So that stuff starts to build up and just got to manage it.
Yeah, and I know that can be difficult.
I like to say this, and Neil thinks it's very profound, but your perspective changes when your perspective changes, right?
Right.
So you think you may know what you're looking at, but then once you get into that position, that's even with cases you work or something, and everybody's like, well, that's easy to do. You do this. But when you get there, your perspective changes and the view is different.
Yeah, and you see kind of me smile a little bit, and it's like when you're in patrol, and I remember, of course, I've been on 28 and a half years, and Neil and I started about the same time, but you kind of look at detectives and you kind of go, what are those guys doing? We're out here running all these calls and this and that, and they're just sitting at their desk back there until you make that transition, and then you're going, oh, wow. I may be busier in this division than that I was out on the street. Again, a lot of patrol work is, predicated upon, the volume of calls or self-initiated activity. This division doesn't operate that way. You consistently, you guys have any idea where you might be as far as an active caseload right now? How many cases you're working, Neil?
I just cleared out 3 cases. I had 3 cases I'm carrying, in which I know I'm going to start getting cases along the line. I want, just to build on what everyone else is saying, this is a level of stress, being a detective in case management, that you don't experience on the line. And you have victims, families, advocates who are contacting you after hours because they assume that whenever you're available. And so it never really stops. I stay awake at night thinking about cases. I've got to do this. I've got a busy day tomorrow, and all these things. So the management aspect of it is just a different type of stress.
And then you throw in a kink that you're running with your cases pretty hard, and then all of a sudden you get a subpoena. Hey, you're sitting second chair at a trial that'll last a week. So everything's put on the sidelines for that week while you're in trial, and then you have to pick back up on it. And that's if you don't get no more cases, or some information comes in, like in my case, you get information about someone wanting to talk about an old murder that they want to come forward and give information on. Then you're firing that one back up. So it's a juggling, it's a triage kind of thing.
Yeah, and I know, from also working back there that there's times where it's a collective effort. If something, big happens, it's what we call that all skate, everybody's there. But, and I know with you, Paul, being a crime scene investigator as well as I was, and, it's sometimes you're also piggybacking on a lot of those investigations, plus you're still trying to maintain a caseload and investigate.
Yeah, so one of these there may be a homicide or a robbery or something that I may per se not get assigned to. Say Tom or Zach or somebody gets assigned to it. I still have a ton of involvement in it because I still respond, at 3 a.m. because that's when all this happens, and process the scene, collect the evidence, submit the evidence to the state lab. Even though I'm doing all that while I still have my own caseload, I'm still working.
So maybe just talk a little bit, and that's the good thing, I guess, about just having this in a casual conversation. We kind of all over navigate, but maybe just talk a little bit about what to be a crime scene investigator, what that kind of entails. Because I think, right, Zach, you're potentially going to be going to that, we call it a school, but that training here shortly.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
So the training I went to was done. It was held by the Indiana State Police. It was at the Indiana Law Enforcement Academy. I think it was 4 or 8 weeks. I'm not even really sure anymore. But it's a really good school, and you learn a lot. The importance of crime scene management. And I just got back from a homicide school. Zach and I went to homicide school together in Louisville, Kentucky. And in that school, they talked about one of the key things why homicides may go unsolved is crime scene management. So it's very important to preserve crime scenes, and that starts with patrol, putting the tape up that people may see on TV or whatever, the crime scene tape, putting that tape up and making sure that no evidence gets tainted and it gets moved. And first responders, unfortunately, are very common with doing that. Medics come in, the fire department comes in, paramedics, all these people come in. Their goals and objectives are very different than ours. Their goal is to, life-saving measures. So they may come in, they may step on shell casings, they may move things out of the way to save a life. They're not knowing that they're altering a crime scene. So managing all of that, collecting things. And when we go through training, they kind of use the analogy, it's kind of like a garbage collector. You're collecting all these things, not knowing the relevance of it. Later in the investigation, you can determine if it's important, if it's not important. But it's best to collect things you don't know if you need rather than not collecting things you do need. Yeah,
and I often say on an outdoor crime scene, and we've all experienced this, inclement weather, if you've got high wind, rain, snow, that's going to alter or change. If you've got, say, a shoe impression and now it's raining, so sometimes that clock can be ticking. Then you have to be able to prioritize. We got to get this photographed, scaled, collected, before we may do something else. But so that school actually, I believe, is 8 weeks, which I think that is that on the books for you in the near horizon?
I don't think there's a class scheduled yet. But
okay.
Whenever one opens up, I'm supposed to be put into it.
Yeah. And again, we've seen, say just in the last 5 years, lots of retirements. And I think that, obviously Tom's on the horizon. I'm on the horizon. Don't know about Neil yet, but, could be.
February 28th, 2030.
Okay. So, those are all a lot of experience, even just to say, between, captain, jury, and you're talking 100 some years of law enforcement experience that you may lose in the next, say, 5 years. And that's where, like in the previous podcast, we talked about, you have to train up. You have to gain that wisdom, experience, and sometimes it's trial by fire. Again, Tom, you talked a little bit about, setting chair or second on a trial. And I know you've set more first chairs than probably, anybody that's been on RPD, I would say.
I've had a few trials, yeah.
Yeah, you've had a few trials.
Tom's been there, done that, and he's got the T-shirt for it.
Yeah, well, I think jokingly on one of them, we were like, yeah, he's the GOAT.
Yeah.
And he blushes a little bit about it, but, Tom is a very humble, hardworking, and I'll give you this compliment, out of everybody I've worked with in my 28 years, I generally, Tom, you've been an invaluable asset to the department, the community. We know where your strengths are, and again, when new detectives or even some of our new officers, like they may not know you personally and know that you've been back in that division for 20 some years and you got 41 years on, and losing that experience, again, we've got to find that next person up mentality. And really it's you guys and those next generation of detectives that we're going to be bringing in. So
I agree with you on this. If there was a way to plug a USB port into the knowledge that Detective Van Middlesworth has and Detective Legear, to use that knowledge to train our future detectives that are coming in. If you can find a way out to do that, let me know, because I certainly would like to do that.
USB is a little thing.
and those are the things, I guess, when you've been here for so, but it's, it's like we've all seen, even in maybe not the short time, but even the time you guys on, how we as, I think, a country and as a profession have evolved in, technology. I know that both of you guys are on the drone team, and you go back to, 5-10 years ago, that wasn't a thing in law enforcement. So I think we as an agency have done a pretty good job of trying to stay ahead of sometimes the things that, make us better at what we do. Obviously, I think that like a lot of agencies, we sometimes can be a little bit restricted because of budgetary constraints. Again, so we have to kind of find, where things kind of fit and need. But, I even feel like the podcast, and again, I'll say it, to the camera that, this podcast that we are doing is really to just build relationships with our viewers and with our community. And I will say, because I don't read the comments, but I know some of our guys do, and there's still some concerns about, what this is costing the agency. And DS1 Live and Scott Owens, who runs our production for us, he's a local vet that just wants to give back to the community, and all the equipment, including the stage, the cameras, our mics, everything. We've not spent a penny as an agency or a city entity to do this. So again, I applaud Scott for giving us the opportunity to kind of talk and share. Because, I've said this, and previously I, talked to some students at a college. It's like, and you guys will know this more so in Captain and Jury, like when we hired on the agency, there were 200 and some applicants, right, Neil? I mean, at Richmond High School.
Filled the whole cafeteria.
The whole cafeteria, probably 250, 60 applicants. Am I right? Yes. And then I remember, and I don't know, and you guys might talk about it, but I remember sitting there going, oh my gosh, they're only hiring like 2 people. Yeah, they're going to establish a list of 20, but we all knew that they were never going to get down to the 20 in 2 years. So I'm thinking, there's no way out of 200 and some people, I'm going to get hired. And it was a very competitive process, and that's changed.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, going and adding what you were saying about the value of the podcast. So when we hired on, the catchword was community policing, right? Mm-hmm. And think about the way we were interacting with the public back then. We were going to neighborhood association meetings. We were going to, and so
Citizens Academy.
Yeah. And so the way we reach out and really helping a community understand how and why we do things, like what due process looks like and things like that.
But again, we go back to this evolution.
Yeah.
Like, when we hired on, what's a podcast?
Yeah.
Right. But now we have the ability to send this message out on a social media platform, which I think, RPD is about 55,000 viewers. So we have the capabilities. And why wouldn't we want our community to see, who we are, that you're Paul, you're Neil, and what we do and who we are. And, and I said it, I still feel like we don't get the applicants as far as the number that we used to. And it maybe is a little bit more difficult to find, I don't want to say that we're compromising quality, but we're still hiring really good people, really good officers. And that's where I think that the community needs to know sometimes how difficult this job can be. I mean, we've all had our, ups and downs in our career, and it's easy when you aren't in this profession to sit back and armchair quarterback everything we do. And I think that that's where a lot of social media, and Lieutenant Lib said it on the second podcast. It's like, a lot of times we hear all this negative and we just sit back and we sometimes don't respond to it, because that's not, we hold ourselves to a higher level. Like, yeah, we're not even going to acknowledge that comment or this or that. And it's like, but should we be addressing those things? And, and again, I feel that the podcast gives us an opportunity just to be fair, open, direct, answer questions if need be.
We are people.
Well, I think there's so much misinformation, particularly locally on social media, that comes through that we can't address directly. You can't address when someone complains about a case because you're in the middle of the case. And so this gives us an opportunity to kind of reach out, give people an understanding, because I continuously see cases. Why aren't the police doing this? Why aren't they doing that? And so, again, we just give them a little bit of
and I'm smiling again because I'm pretty confident if we just totaled up the number of years that is setting back in investigative services, you're probably 200 years combined of police experience, but yet somebody who's not in it critiques the things and it's like, come on, that's just not educated. That's not, what I mean? If you want to, have a conversation about a case or this or that, which we've all experienced that, we're obviously not perfect. We're not robots. We can oversee, make a mistake or not see something, but
a lot of the things that frustrate the general public who really don't know much also frustrate us too, though.
Absolutely.
They may have complaints like, well, why isn't this working? Why can't you arrest him for this? Like, I wish I could. I'm sorry, the law doesn't say that I can. But yeah, I agree that this is a bad situation and maybe this person should be arrested. However, they did not fit that little statute to make that arrest effective.
Yeah.
So true.
Yeah, and it's, and that's where, again, I think that we have to navigate smartly as an agency to stay ahead of, technology, to move forward. And again, we're young right now, right? In the last couple of years, I think we've hired 25 officers. I know we've increased our training, and we're going to have our training coordinator, Sergeant Schuler, on here at some point to talk about it. But I think there was a 200% increase in training that is really needed right now more than ever because we are pretty young, so even you guys, going to these schools and learning that next phase of it, because it's going to be you guys and the other detectives back there that are investigating those homicides that Tom's, done for years. I don't know, but if you guys don't mind, maybe collectively, so I'm not putting Captain Jury on the spot, but just who else is back in that division? So, we kind of have an understanding as who else is in.
Detective Scott Glover, Detective Amanda Thackeray, Detective Chase Patton,
Mark Sutton.
Yeah, Detective Mark Sutton, who's due to retire within the next 2 months.
Yeah, and he's another.
Next 30 days, I think.
Yeah, and he's another one that's going to be, and I know you'll know this, attest to this, another workhorse that's going to be difficult shoes to fill.
And we got
absolutely
Detective Mike Wright, who he's in Muncie, so we have him tasked. The administration has him tasked to do forensic investigating. So he does all of our phones. So whenever we get a search warrant for a phone to be searched, we'll send that phone to Muncie, and then Mike will go through the whole phone, find all the analytics of it, and having him up there is a huge benefit for us because it makes our turnaround time. Because that could be essentially the same thing as taking to the state lab, where it takes months and years to get back. But having Mike up there, we kind of get a priority, and he gets our phone dumps to us in 3-4 days.
Yeah, digital forensics are becoming such a larger part of our investigation.
Well, and again, you say phones, but it's not just the phones.
Yeah, tablets. All types.
Any electronic devices, including cars and things of that nature. We have a dedicated person that's able to, get us the information that we need way quicker. And then, again, the benefit to getting that quicker is we can potentially move forward with getting something charged and getting maybe a person who's, a threat to our community off the streets just that much sooner. And if it takes us 6 months to a year to have to put that information together, that person can still be out, being a threat to the community. So again, Detective Mike Wright, I think that's.
Well, I was going to just say, he was bringing up the other detectives. They all are picking up specialties themselves. We talked about ours, but you got Detective Chase Patton, who does most all our frauds, and he's really good at it. He knows who to contact. He knows he's worked with the banks locally. Scott Glover is now part of ICAC, which is Internet Crimes Against Children, which is the computer forensic stuff where we have people exchanging child pornography, or what's called CSAM now. So, and Amanda, Detective Thackeray's focus is a lot of times on the overdose deaths. Now that the laws have changed to where it gives us some teeth to go after the person that dealt the drugs.
And all of that kind of comes back to preservation of evidence as well. If Mike's able to get us that information from the phones back in a couple of days, we might see some communication in those phones that will lead us down a different road if we got to go find video or talk to a certain person. A lot of times with businesses, video may only last a week or so. So if we can get that communication turned around to us in a couple of days, we can act a lot quicker and preserve some of that evidence that could end up being critical to the case down the road. So it's a really valuable resource.
I had a case where Mike examined the phone and he was able to map everywhere that phone was from the area where the robbery took place, because it was an armed robbery, all the way back to the hotel where the guy went. And I've got it right there on mapping. So it's kind of hard to argue the case when it's right there on mapping that this is where the bad guy was the whole time.
It's kind of like another way of following footprints in the snow. Like we had a couple of investigations.
Sure.
Patrol did a
Just
great
digital
job.
footprints.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can remember being on Thirds, one of the liquor stores on the west side of town, and it was probably January. We had an alarm call there, and sometimes you guys would agree that the alarm calls, you get there and it's false. Happen to get there and see glass breakage. There had been some fresh snow, and I remember we tracked the footprints from there to the Westwood Apartments, actually to the back door of one of the apartments. So we all kind of huddled up and was looking around, and through the blinds you could see them all popping alcohol in there and knock on the door. So again, it's sometimes it's that easy, and sometimes it's not. And again, we go back to technology. Tom, as long as you've been back in detectives, the cell phones, that wasn't a thing 26 years ago.
And I like watching the young kids gloss over when I start describing, we had RODA reports in triplicate when I first started.
Yeah.
We don't know what that means.
What is handwrite, right? Yeah.
Call boxes.
Yeah. Well, you didn't have call boxes, but the fire department did, but we didn't. But just how it's changed over the years and how things are done nowadays compared to what it was.
And so that's kind of on that point with like the no DNA. So that's the first thing that these investigators are doing, like on cold case homicides. They'll submit all the evidence. And I mean, even back then, in cases Tom worked back in the day, the investigators still had the wherewithal to collect these things. Now we can go through that evidence and maybe send that to the lab for DNA. And there's a lot of cool advancements in DNA for like familial DNA. So you'll see these people who do like Ancestry and Me or these things where they'll go and they just want to see their genealogy and see what their ancestry history is. And these labs can now use those to kind of come up with, this person's a cousin to whoever's DNA is on there. Then you can go down that family tree and then track a suspect that way.
Yeah, DNA honestly was just a game changer, I think, for law enforcement. And I still think there's still going to be some evolution to that because, we know this with the job that we do. And we, the discussions like, can you get DNA off certain things? And some things, you can get a great DNA sample off of, and other things maybe you can't quite as good. So say maybe casings from, a shots, a homicide, and there's casings on the ground, extracting DNA from those. So I still think there's technology out there that we still will, eventually be able to get.
Oh, I was amazed at one of my cases where a guy was beaten with a tree limb, and they got DNA off the tree limb.
Yeah.
From the suspect.
Technology is constantly evolving. Our job is constantly evolving. So like you mentioned the experience earlier, it's critical for us to draw on that experience. I'm fortunate enough to share cube space with Tom. So since I've gotten back there, it's just learning from him, asking him questions, taking him out to knock on doors, just constantly growing so that when these guys do leave, we are ready to take that over.
Yeah, and I know you kind of...
Yeah, hold on. I'm trying not to be offended by that because he's supposed to be my cube mate.
Yeah.
Well, just because you have matching hairs, it doesn't mean...
Who wore it better?
Yeah. Definitely not Tom and Neil.
Yeah.
But
We'll also have matching.
yeah, in color. So it's definitely, I think, important in law enforcement abroad to stay either current or ahead of those evolutions. We talked to Lieutenant Lips and our patrol officers about wearing body cameras. That wasn't something you guys didn't wear them when you were on the street, right?
No, they came in shortly after I left.
Yeah,
the street,
so just even those, I don't want to say short years, but in a short duration, we've evolved into, wearing body cameras. And again, as an agency, that's an expense, to not only, purchase, lease, or whatever, but to maintain the storage. And now, not only with that, you have the capability to go back and review those things to maybe help with writing a report. And I remember hiring on, we had, and Tom, you could probably talk more so, but they would dispatch you to a call, and I had a little suction cup with a little notepad on there, and as dispatch would give you the call, you'd pull over and write the address down and try to get all that information in there that was relevant. And now it just auto-populates on a computer. You can read it.
What do they call the street guide?
Street guides. Yeah.
New construction.
Yeah.
Because Google Maps wasn't invented yet.
Yeah. So again, I think it's important to always stay ahead of that, and you kind of was joking, Tom, about the USB cord and this and that, but I think it's also equally as important because, you guys are from a different generation. I'm in my 50s. I know Neil is. Tom, we won't talk about. I'm sure Andy's close to that. But, the technology that maybe you guys grew up with, and, even some of our younger officers that are in their early 20s, I'm not familiar as maybe they are. So, again, I had you do a presentation recently, and I've not, spent a lot of time creating PowerPoints and presentation stuff. And what you guys did pretty quickly was great. So again, having that blend, I think it benefits the agency because, again, we talk about reconstructing a crime scene. Back then, Tom, things were probably hand sketched. Sounds kind of.
Yeah. Drew sketches as
Yeah.
well as photography.
So-
And back when I first started, we shot 35 millimeter and we only had 10 photo rolls because they didn't want us using a bunch of photos. So you might have to take 4 or 5 rolls of pictures and then take them to get them developed. Now digital's come into play, and we joked with Gerard Longnecker, who's retired now, but Gerard would take 300 or 400 digital photos of the scene.
And now those crime scenes can be rendered 3D. So I've got a program that I use where I can make it as accurate as it is. So on scene, you may see me with a tape measure. I'm measuring how maybe it's a body on the floor, how far the body is from the east wall or whatever. And that all can be reconstructed in 3D. And when it comes to court, the jury can look at, rather than looking at photographs or a sketch, because when I went through school, they still taught us a sketch as well. But they can look at a 3D rendering where it's as accurate as we can make it. It may match the same flooring and everything. So it's a whole, and you can move it all the way around. You can zoom in, and it gives the jury demonstrative evidence. It gives them good perspective of what the crime scene looked like, and they may understand it better than 300 photos that you may not know where's where.
And a pattern nowadays, too, and the prosecutor's office has been, on major cases, they'll take the jury out to the scene so they can see it. Or we'll go out and photograph it. If it's a nighttime scene, we'll photograph it in daylight so they can have a perspective of where everything's at.
Yeah, and I know that both those examples, you and I both know the case that you're maybe kind of referring to, but one of our apartment complexes down south, we had a homicide.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we got called out at night. We were there for quite a while, examining, processing the scene, came back the next day, did a second kind of overview of everything, took more photographs, made sure in daylight we didn't, miss anything. And I believe in that case, the jury ended up coming back out and kind of walking the area so they could see kind of firsthand. Easily, I think, that it's when a juror can kind of see, and actually walk it and visualize things versus just seeing it in a courtroom. I think it gives them a different or better perspective, obviously.
It makes it real rather than a presentation or something.
Yeah.
It brings life to it, I think.
Yeah.
Because some of the jurors maybe never even knew where that apartment complex was.
Yeah. And I know the other thing that sometimes that happens, and this again is kind of more in the courts, but, all of our officers have department issued cell phones. So again, you go back to that digital evidence. And one of the things that we've taught our officers to do, it's, officer safety, crime scene, security and those things, rendering aid. And then once outside that, get the perimeter secured and start getting photographs because, as you said, potentially that crime scene is going to change, and we know that it does. There's evidence that's going to get either brought in or evidence that's going to get taken out. So the quicker that we can, document by photos, it definitely changes things. And I think that same investigation that we had, and I know you and I've talked about this because we go into some of the schools and talk to the kids about, evidence and crime scene processing. But that specific case, there were some shoe impressions that were at that crime scene. And I think, this was before you were a detective, you were on patrol, but you were one of the first people there. And, you were taking photographs of those shoe impressions. And as the night went on, just merely due to other first responders being there, those prints can get altered.
Yeah, or even because those were wet, and so it became dry. It's called transient evidence.
Yes.
So, like in a shooting, you're stabbing, everybody is going to that area and walking through your evidence.
Yeah, and I know the one thing that we've also, as an agency, have done and I think are building, and I know you guys are part of it, is, the drone side of things, being able to take and do a aerial view of, say, a crime scene that's over maybe we get a homicide and there's a shooting and there's, a vehicle involved and there's shots fired here and casings down the road and around the block. And, you can kind of give that bird's eye view a little bit more. I think it only, again, and you said it really well, that it gives, instead of a presentation, it's giving a juror or the prosecutor even a better look at, what's there. And again, if officers don't use their cell phones, then it's going to be challenged. Like, well, did you have the capabilities to take your cell phone out and take photos before it got altered? Well, why didn't you do that? And then, we have to explain why we didn't do that either.
And we have to maintain that perspective because a lot of times as we do these investigations, it may be a year or two down the road when this case is actually going to trial. So we have to make sure we're properly documenting with photography, video, thorough reports and narratives, interviews, and things like that, because we have to be able to go back years down the road and paint that picture for the jury when it comes time for the trial.
Yeah, I've been a strong advocate for our young guys to, if you're not doing nothing, go to trial. Go sit on a trial and watch it.
Yeah.
Listen to what the arguments are.
And I know that the 4 officers that we have currently at the academy that should be graduating here in a couple of weeks, I think that's something that they got to do before they went to the academy, was go over and watch a trial. And I would say that, it's equally as important, not only as a detective, but at the patrol level, to see what that is. Because, I mean, have you had to sit first chair on a trial yet?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So we all have, and it, until you're there in that seat, especially if it's on, say, maybe a homicide, where you're, got a very well case put together, doesn't always equal that you're going to get that conviction, and that's difficult. And that's something that, I think we all live with just as humans. You're trying to represent a victim and their family, and you're doing everything you can as best as you can collectively to get this thing to a successful prosecution. And we feel that stress sometimes. You talk about not sleeping at night. I'm sure that, like I remember some of the trials I've had. It's like, man, that whole week you're just exhausted mentally, physically, just because of, everything that's going on, and you're waiting this outcome and you hope that you did the best you could and there's nothing. But everything we do in that courtroom, it's going to get challenged, right?
Why did you do this, or why didn't you do that?
Yeah. So, again, I think that speaks volumes to the next generation of our detectives, bringing them up and sharing that wisdom that we have and those experiences.
That's where we're at a downfall with the transition with the culture with our police department, with all the senior officers and investigators leaving. We have these newer guys coming in, and where you started your career, maybe Detective Van Millsworth, Detective Legear, myself, we had a lot of the older generation that we could rely on for mentorship. Not necessarily the supervisors, but that whole culture has changed, and where that knowledge is just it's leaving rapidly. We're such a young new department.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this in a previous episode, but when and I know that, for at least Neil and probably Andy and I, when we hired on day shift patrol, you're looking at 16 to 18 years before you could, possibly, that was like, I remember some of those former officers, that they were the least senior person and they had 16 years on, and you were going, man. And, again, I think we're going to see that kind of move back toward that as we continue to have these retirements, people leave, that we're going to, because, we've got, some officers on day shift that are probably at that 5 or 6 year mark, maybe.
Yeah, I got to day shift at 5 years.
Yeah. And again, and detectives. How many years you got on now, Zach?
About 9.
Yeah, and back in the day, like when I was like, you had to have 25 plus years to get back in detectives. So it's again, I think we're going to see that kind of slowly swing back to getting to where we're the retirees have all kind of left, and we've got some guys that are like that mid 20-year point right now, and then we drop off kind of significantly. So, is there anything else that you guys can think of? I know we've kind of talked kind of a little bit all over the place, but from the investigative services, anything that you guys think that's important that maybe we didn't discuss?
Well, I think, detectives back there wear many hats, for lack of a better way to call it. Paul and Zach do drone. I back up our lab technician on evidence.
Glover, Pat, and then I do CVSAs.
Yeah, CVSA examinations, which is a computerized version of a lie detector.
Is that right? Computer stress analysis.
Yeah, most of our
Voice
detectives
stress
do have
analysis.
collateral duties in addition to their investigative duties. Like he's mentioned, the Detective Glover, he's also a firearms instructor like yourself.
Yeah.
We have Detective Sutton. He's in charge of our diversion program. That's a lot of knowledge walking out the door. Like you mentioned with Detective Hutchinson and Detective Huskisson, with the drone thing, that takes an immense amount of training to dedicate yourself to and to keep up on. Detective Van Millsworth, I can't tell you the number of hats he wears.
The outreach and the education. So whether it's doing presentation within the schools, digital safety and citizenship, all those kind of things. So
Well, and I'd like for you to maybe talk about that a little bit. Both of my kids, just like yours, they're older now. They kind of made it through, but there's a lot of, I guess, crime that goes on with our younger kids probably now so more than ever when it comes to cell phones and it's difficult. Obviously, every parent's discretion at what age they're going to provide a electronic device, but even some of this stuff, and this is not my forte, but you hear like Roblox and things like that, and maybe talk a little bit about that. So if you have that parent that's watching today to understand like kind of what goes on, because I think that for a lot of people and some of the people I know, I don't want to say it's naive. They just don't know that the capability exists for some person 3 states over to be talking to your 10-year-old kid who thinks they're just gaming.
Well, but there are a lot of threats and there's a lot of vulnerabilities. So I did just an experiment. And I went to all the elementary schools, and what I found was just in polling third graders. So 85% of third graders have access to a smartphone or a tablet that they inherited through an older sibling, from a parent, and they're actively involved. And they start out relatively benign apps like Roblox, but every app is a portal into the large internet and access to all kinds of people, some who are sinister. And so we experience vulnerabilities, and trying to get parents to understand that you're giving your kids access to the internet and everything that means. But children start on Roblox, but then their friends are on Facebook, and then they started to get into social media. We are dealing with 10-year-olds who are sending nudity to not some 40-year-old guy in his mom's basement 3 states over, but to their friends. And so the vulnerabilities aren't always out there, and they aren't always the stereotype. A lot of the vulnerability, a lot of the crimes I investigate are peer-to-peer, 10 to 11-year-olds, and they're given access, and they don't understand, and they don't process the vulnerabilities. Every parent needs to have a conversation with their child, and every parent needs to be involved with, because they don't. We don't. We were lucky, I think, because our children grew up right when social media was really starting to take hold. But I think children now and parents always think that the vulnerability is their, is some sinister guy from 5 states over. And just as much, it's peer-to-peer sharing of intimate photos, like I say, between 10-year-olds, which is crazy to believe, but children don't understand, don't have maturity of the filter to understand what they should or shouldn't, and children don't discuss things with their parents.
And I know I've had a couple conversations with you in the past just about kind of what you're talking about, where, I hate to use the word blackmail, but a kid will like, well, if you don't this, or this, I'm going to Yeah. I mean, they're going to show those photos to somebody else. And, it kind of, it does. It breaks our heart collectively that you got to think about, a 10-year-old, being coerced into.
But we just had the case, weeks ago with a 10-year-old who was on Snapchat. Parents didn't know she had Snapchat. Her friends have Snapchat. No child under the age of 16 should have Snapchat. While she is on Snapchat, she is video chatting with 2 male friends of one of her friends, none of whom know each other person to person, but this generation develops relationships differently than we did. So they begin to do intimate things to this 10-year-old who immediately records it and sends it to all her friends. So, just exposed to adult content with no filter at such a young age. And that's common. And, everybody involved in that was under the age of 14.
So I would urge you as parents, just with your children, and Neil, you probably could say it best.
Access, discussion, understand your children. This generation processes relationships differently than we did. And so understanding and helping their children process and contextualize the digital world and giving their children access so that they can come to them whenever they experience something that they don't understand, they don't like, because that's where we get into trouble, is the children don't involve their parents as they start to go down these crazy rabbit holes of vulnerability. And so, yeah, that's the biggest thing. Discuss with your children, contextualize, and know what they are doing. Know what apps they are using, because children transition from Roblox to Snapchat in a matter of a couple of years.
Yeah, and I know a couple kids that are, first and second graders that are on Roblox. And I don't know a lot about the game. Obviously, my boys are older, but, if you look at, like you said, that's maybe a potential portal to the bigger internet, then the chance of them maybe being a victim of something is definitely going to go up, because we know there's predators out there. And it's difficult sometimes as a parent to think that, well, not my child, but I think everybody probably has that mentality. And again, it really should just be the opposite. What am I doing to safeguard my children or my child from?
Yeah. The biggest thing is allowing your child, a very young child, to take a smartphone upstairs in a bedroom unregulated we wouldn't allow our children to take alcohol, to take a gun, or all these, because we understand that these are all inherently dangerous things. We just don't understand that because it's just micro traumas that these children normalize through social media.
Yeah, so I would urge you parents, again, not trying to sound by how to parent, but we see it, we know it exists, and it's obviously difficult, but we would love to just, encourage parents to take that time, make sure you're monitoring, having those discussions with your children on what they're doing. And if you don't know that maybe one thing is leading to something else, get online and search it. Call Detective Van Middlesworth, have a conversation, obviously, and just say, hey, I noticed my child was on this or that. Should I be concerned? And, again, you may not think that it's something that would lead to that, but, we definitely want to make sure our children
Absolutely.
are protected.
Yeah, involved parenting.
Yeah. Anything else from anybody that you guys can think of that you want to throw out and discuss? I feel today's been pretty informative, but at the same time, I don't want to, sometimes we get to talk and we might forget about, you guys didn't even mention this or that, but,
I was just sitting thinking, for the scams, the online scams, and the elderly who are being scammed by people, and we get called to try to help, and the person's in another foreign country or something in that nature, or they've already bought the PayPal card, scratched them off and gave them the numbers, and they're out the money. If it's too good to be true, it probably is not true. And families need to kind of keep an eye on the elderly, and maybe, not saying you have to micromanage their abilities to take care of their funds, but keep an eye on them, because we're getting a lot of those lately.
Yeah, and I know that we try to do a good job as an agency on our social media platforms to warn people of those scam alerts. And it just this week, I got one of those notices, like a summons from the court in Indianapolis telling me to scan this. And I look at it, and the first thing I looked at is my name on there? It's not.
Indianapolis is spelled wrong.
I didn't look that far at it. I looked for my name, and I knew obviously it wasn't me because I hadn't been in Indianapolis. But, there is that little bit of you that goes, well, we were in Indianapolis last week, or, could this be, and then you click on a link or you do whatever, and then you're buying into it again. And we typically find more that it's the older generation who maybe isn't, as knowledgeable about what's going on in these scams. I mean, my mom was a victim of it. I remember her calling me, and she was on her tablet, I think on some social media platform. Next thing you know, she's talking to somebody and her mouse is moving around, and then she's got money taken out of her bank account. She felt like she needed to pay this amount to maintain this. And again, it typically ends up being a scam.
Well, the one I'm thinking of is the one you're talking about, but it's sent to their text messages.
Yeah.
How would they know your phone number to begin with?
Yeah.
To send you that?
And that's what I got.
Just randomly sending
It was a text message.
They're just randomly sending it to numbers and hoping for the best.
Yeah.
One person responds, and then possibly can get money out of it.
Yeah. Were you going to say something, Zach?
I was going to touch on a different topic. I know we talked about the importance of this podcast and reaching out to the community, and I was just going to touch on community relations and just how important that relationship is between us. When it comes to crimes occurring in your neighborhood, they recognize the patterns better than anybody in their area where they live. So if you're seeing something that's out of sorts in your neighborhood, don't hesitate to call and report it. If you are a witness to a crime, don't assume that someone else is called. Go ahead and place that call yourself so that we can get that information. Leverage that technology. I think cameras are so important nowadays that if you don't have a camera, go ahead and stick a camera or two up on your house. It's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. So
just external lighting too.
Yep, protection, deterrence, but it protects you if something happens to your property. It helps us with the case, and then just not being afraid to reach out and communicate, provide those statements. All of that helps us work together to solve these cases.
And you go back to like maybe when we hired on, cameras weren't as prevalent or as they are nowadays. It maybe was just some of the local businesses that had cameras, and now we find that more businesses, more residents have. If we have a crime that occurs, in say the 200 block of South 12th Street, when we do that canvas, we can go down that street and look to see who has cameras on their porches. And sometimes we get really lucky. I could think of a couple instances where we've had a homicide or a shooting, and you pretty much capture, either an individual or the shooting or the car leaving the scene. I remember one investigation I had. I tracked the shooter from the area of kind of like North 8th and E all the way to the south end of town, and was just able to go to businesses and say, yep, there's a camera on this block. And you can see a vehicle fleeing at a high rate of speed and actually leading back to a particular residence. So, again, sometimes we, get, I don't want to say lucky, but, we get the benefit of, the community and maybe some of the tools that exist out there. But are there any other tools that you think, does anybody have any information about that flock system that we run, and maybe talk a little bit about what flock is and how we use that?
So flock's like a license plate reader system. It does not track constant movement like some, at least that we don't have access to. So I know there's a lot of concern about privacy and things like that. But also,
and I guess let me just ask you this. When it comes to the privacy, what is the concern? Because what I mean by that is if you're on a public roadway and I'm driving out on the east side of Richmond, there's no expectation of privacy in that.
Yeah, I think there's just a concern about how invasive it may seem. People just don't like the feeling that we could be constantly tracking their movements. But ultimately, it's an investigative tool that we use when necessary. So it can just help monitor if the person's in an area of a crime that we are specifically investigating, not checking that camera for every plate that hit that day. But it can be a critical tool to a crime occurred in an area, this vehicle was in the area, and it tracks us back to a suspect.
Found a lot of stolen cars.
Yeah, stolen vehicles. It's just a tool that helps us serve the community better.
Yeah, and again, I think you said it really well that we don't access any of that footage until it's specifically related to maybe a crime. I think we had a shooting some years ago in an apartment complex on the east side of town, and our suspects were out at Dayton, and we were
I'm working it.
Yeah, and I know you would know and know about, but to have the capability to get a vehicle description or maybe a plate number, or maybe the vehicle gets stopped at a red light and now you can see the occupants inside. So those are all tools that sometimes, if they exist out there, that we can rely on. And again, it's very easy to feel like, people are invading my privacy and those types of things, but it's not like we have somebody sitting there monitoring, cameras all day long, looking at everybody who comes in and out.
Well, I think our access is a very narrow focus, right? I mean, you have to have a specific vehicle for a specific reason to be able to access the information. So it's not just searching or just grafting whoever's out there or
For
tracking
example,
someone.
pickup truck, black Ford pickup truck, and we're looking for a black Ford, so we're just going to look for black Ford pickup trucks and hopefully find one with a plate available to us.
And you're going to look at it in that small parameter of maybe from 7:45 in the morning till 8:30 in the morning. It's not a total duration, and maybe a specific area. If maybe a witness says, well, it left going eastbound here, then that's the focus of where we, try to keep it. I know there are things that we could probably go into a little bit about, like search warrants and things of that nature that, obviously require that we have to complete in order to, say, maybe get into a property or a vehicle or even a phone sometimes, any type of electronic device. And, search warrants are, part of that investigative process, and in patrol, again, it's not something that they typically do. So they're not real familiar with it. But once you're back in, detective division, I mean, search warrants are a pretty normal thing that you have to complete, which, that after it gets completed will go to the prosecutor's office for review, gets signed off, and then goes to a judge. And then obviously if the search warrant is granted, then that would give, the investigators the authority to go in and to search, whether it be a premises, a safe, a vehicle, information, DNA, all those things. Obviously sometimes we are given consent to maybe to gain that access to that stuff. But, I know from an investigative side of things, we typically would prefer to, have a search warrant just to, cover ourselves, going through that investigative process. Anything else? Anybody else like to add?
Well, go ahead.
I think what the viewers might like is maybe a little bit of more of a perspective of when our detectives get called out. I previously talked about our guys get called out after hours, when everybody's awake, nobody's went to bed yet, they're making child care arrangements, or, they're having to cut their dinner short, or, whatever activity they're doing to ensure they can respond to whatever the investigation is. But let's talk about late at night. I know what all these guys' voices sound like at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's not always pleasant. Detective Legear, though, he's amazing. He sounds like at 3 o'clock in the morning, like he does during the day. He answers the phone. He's ready to go. You cannot replace him.
I think a couple of our former supervisors said, I'll give you a minute, wake up, and then they'll start talking to me.
Tom goes to every call out. He's never not available.
Well, and the thing with that is for those of us that, married, girlfriend, whatever, it's like they get the inconvenience also of waking up at 3 a.m. and hearing the phone go off, and then you on the phone answering it, and then you're like,
wondering what we're doing.
I got to go in, and then they never get to sleep.
No, let me say on the flip side of that, they probably don't enjoy my voice at 3 o'clock in the morning either.
Yeah.
So, fair.
I find it very soothing.
Yeah, put you right back to sleep.
But what these guys get, they don't know what they're getting into. They get that phone call. It's from me or from Lieutenant Brett, and they're either getting asked to respond to process a crime scene for, like, Detective Hutchinson, CSI guy. I might have Detective Legear go to the police department and start drafting a search warrant for residents. I may have Detective Van Middlesworth respond to either transport witnesses or meet with patrol at the city building to conduct these interviews with witnesses. And, if we have a victim at the hospital, Detective Hutchinson may go there to try to interview that victim before they have to go to some type of medical procedure to get that critical information. That's helpful in a lot of ways. One, you can get that critical information, especially if it's an ongoing event. You have an emergency in the community. You need to get that information to disseminate it out to patrol or to your fellow detectives. But anyway, what I'm saying is these guys have to be versatile. Like I was saying about case management, they have to be able to plug themselves in any different aspect of an investigation. These guys all do an amazing job. They have good attitudes, and they are willing to make that sacrifice.
Yeah, and one thing now that I hear you kind of talking about a little bit that we maybe didn't talk about, but there's a process, to get to this point in your career. You have to have a minimum number of years that you've been a police officer. There's a very, I would say, competitive process, and that process is really open to anyone within the agency that would be eligible. There's a written examination, and that examination is predicated upon all the books and study materials and everything that you're given to study and review and read, and you're competing against your colleagues to potentially try to get, ranked number one on that list. So you've got the minimum years requirement, you've got the testing process, you've got an oral interview with the board. I think they also look at your performance evaluations. So it's a pretty comprehensive process. And if we're all in that process, and it just happens to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then when that next position becomes available, then number one's offered the opportunity. Some officers take it, some don't. I know for me, when I went through the process, that I was had been in patrol for 13, 14 years and was just looking for that next challenge in my career. I still love patrol work. Like I'm sure, you guys still.
I work a lot of patrol still. I worked Monday night.
Yeah, still love the patrol work. I know Captain Jury does. Getting out on the street and interacting with people and that type of work still. But again, it's a certain time in your career, and you're looking for that next challenge, that next thing, like even you saying, hey, I want to go to crime scene investigation school. We've had that conversation because I went to the school and he did, the demands of it and the practical test, the written test, and everything that comes with it, the additional responsibilities, because you're not only going to have your cases to investigate, but you're going to be jumping in and facilitating and helping on other cases. But, once that process or that opportunity, you make it through it and you're offered. And it's really kind of like starting your learning process all over again, because there's so much that you got to kind of learn when you get back there. And I remember, coming back, it's not like your first case that you get back there is going to be a homicide case. You're going to start at that lower level, and you're going to eventually work your way up. And I think a lot of that is contingent on the people that we have back there. Again, once, Detective Sutton and Detective Legear leave, and Neil at some point. Now I think we're going to drop down to where you've got somebody that's got 12 or 15 years on, that's maybe only been a detective for 2 or 3 years. So it's big shoes to fill, and again, and I think we're doing a great job, led by Captain Jury and the admin, just trying to get us the training and tools and exposure that we need. So we'll close with this. Either give me something that's a hobby for you outside of work, or if you can think maybe of a story or a situation on an investigation or something that kind of sticks out in your mind.
I'll give you my hobby, I guess. Well, we do a lot of traveling. My wife and I go to Disney World way too much. We were there 2 weeks ago. We have a 5-year-old son who is a Disney fanatic, so he knows where all the parks are. He knows all the rides at each different park. So traveling and Disney's kind of are my hobby outside of work. I do a lot of home renovating too. Just got done remodeling my basement. I need somebody to come do some flooring for me if anybody can do that. But,
I know some guys.
Yeah, but that's what I do a lot.
What about you, Neil? Any stories or hobbies?
Hobbies, it's kind of easy. I think in this job we see and experience a lot of really negative stuff. So on your outside time, I really gravitate to coaching or actually playing pickleball, just interacting with people. And I seek out really positive environments, whether it's church, those kind of things. That's really where I go. As far as the story, I never really realized what are good stories until I'm about halfway through and I see the look on people's faces. We talk about Goolsby, or we talk about Dennis, those kind of things. None of those stand out.
Tom?
I fish, have a boat, and go to the lake tournament fish. Used to tournament fish, and that's mainly the camp now. I'm kind of camping, starting in my twilight, so I'm getting into stuff that'll be more relaxing, hopefully.
Well, I know that you and I have done some side-by-side UTV trips all over the place, West Virginia several times. And I know in one of the previous podcasts, that was one of my hobbies that I enjoy, just being outdoors in the mountains, exploring and riding.
Yeah.
Any stories that pop off that we can share?
Like in regards to cases? And
Yeah,
stuff?
just anything.
I remember the captain calling me, and I was on a lake during a tournament, and it was a local lake, so I was going to be back home in a little bit. And he says, "We got a homicide. I need you to come in." I said, "I'm on the lake fishing a tournament." "Well, get here as soon as you can," was the answer. And I got in, got back, stored the boat, come to the building, and ended up having to go and collect evidence for where they found out where it had been dumped at. So we still get involved in stuff, even if we can't be right off the bat.
Well, and that's where I kind of really just wish that, and I think that most America understands, the commitment that we make in this profession. And you're a prime example of it, Tom. You've been doing this for 41 years. You've probably been on call for probably 40 to 41 of those years, and some responsibility to where you've had to be accessible all the time. I mean, we've been on trips in West Virginia before, and you're like, yeah, I just, they didn't realize you were out of town or something. And we're getting calls that, hey, can you come in? And that's a big expectation.
Our guys have to cancel vacations because
trial
right then. You talked about the Chinese restaurant. We were all on SWAT together at the time.
Yep.
And then as soon as the call was done on SWAT, had to go change clothes and started as a detective.
Yeah.
And started helping process the scene because we didn't have a CSI back then. It was the detectives, whoever was designated.
Yeah, and Neil and I, we were on SWAT. We responded to it. We weren't detectives, so obviously when we were done, we got to go back to camping. But that was a commitment. I don't remember what year was that. You think early 2000s?
Yeah. I'm trying to remember. Yeah, it was like 2002.
That's I think maybe two
months of the other incident.
Yeah, but again, we were up at Knightstown with our wives. Our kids were young,
the wife and kids.
and Kurt Leverton was with us. Yeah, and we left the wife and kids. And I think if I remember the story right, Kurt's pager, what are those, right?
Yeah.
Went off first, and Kurt's, we just, I think, assumed that it was probably canine related because he was a canine handler. And then our pagers went off, and we're like, no, it's SWAT. And like, no, there's been, a shooting. We've got somebody that's barricaded,
I was at my son's football game
up at Northeastern. Yeah, so, again, we drove back with the hazards on, trying to get here as quick as we can. I think we ended up getting an escort, and then it's,
yeah, that's right.
Getting in your car, getting your uniform on, and getting there. Those are sacrifices that, and sometimes, guys, we're not at best telling each other that, hey, appreciate your service. I mean, because, again, 41 years of serving your community in that capacity, I appreciate it just as a community member to think that I've got people that are that dedicated that they're willing to give up. You're missing your son's football game, right?
Yeah,
to go
close to halftime.
Yeah,
hopefully.
yeah. But I mean, nobody wants to do that, right? Our families are as much of a priority to us than they are for anybody.
Yeah, but we say that, but we do love it.
Absolutely.
I mean, that trip from Knightstown, I'm sure you guys have a merry old time. Yeah, you guys.
Well, we had one little flashlight. We've got it out the window. We're flashing, and Kurt's hitting the brights off and on and the hazards. And I think the truckers weren't happy that we were trying to get around them, and they're trying to block us in. But yeah, we were.
And that's how it is.
Shooter.
I'll say that's how it is for us now. Like when the captain does call us at 3 a.m., it sucks. That phone call's not fun. But I do want to go. I want to be a part of it.
Especially if it's like 20 degrees out and the crime scene's outside.
Yeah, I remember
but
that.
we all do this job because we love the job. We don't do it for really many other reasons.
You mean you don't do it for the pay?
Yeah, it's not the pay.
Yeah.
And talking to new officers or to recruiting officers, I always joke, you kind of describe it as it's the best job in the world to not know what you're going to do from 1 minute to the next, let alone 1 day to the next.
What's the analogy they use? The front row seat to the greatest show on earth.
Yeah, and that's where I feel like, for me particularly, personally, I've tried to, like with our cadet program, seek out those next group of young individuals that have an interest and let them get that front row seat. We've got some cadets right now. I think we've got about 15 cadets. 12 of them are very active. We've got some interns, and I've got one cadet. He's also our intern that's got close to 400 hours of now time that he's invested with either training, ride-alongs, and I mean, so proud of him, and that I know that he wants to work for RPD in a couple years when he turns 21. So, finding and seeking out, and again, having conversations with this next generation of officers, because we're not getting the 250 applicants. You know, and it's so interesting because I get the opportunity to talk to that next potential generation, and maybe even students in school that aren't thinking criminal justice, because they kind of see this, just the uniform and patrol work. And then you start talking about other things that they potentially can do, like drones or forensics. But when you talk to them, and I always open up with a question, it's like, well, why do you think it's, 20 applicants now versus 250? And you know what they always tell me? Negative social media. And again, that's why I believe in, like, even this podcast, that we have the opportunity to present to our community in Richmond, Indiana, who we are as individuals, who we are as an agency, how passionate we are about what we do. 41 years, and I know you still love this job. I mean, we see it every day, and your drive to go out and do it. So it's important, I feel like, for us to be looking at that next generation of young, adults that want to come into this profession and understand that there's a lot of sacrifices, but there's also a lot of rewards. Any stories, hobbies?
I don't really have any stories jumping out at me right this moment, but hobby-wise, mostly revolve around my family. My wife and I have 3 young kids. The oldest just started travel softball in the last year, so we've been super busy with that, traveling around to tournaments and things like that. Middle child just started rec softball, and then my youngest just started t-ball yesterday. So sports, I'm a big sports fan aside from that, watching him, going to events, and then church as well, Vacation Bible School, community days and things like that. So.
Good deal. What about you, Andy?
I don't know that I have a story that's G-rated that I could share. A lot of them are R-rated, so I'll leave that one alone. But my passion, my hobby is actually this profession. I knew from being a young kid that this is what I wanted to do, and when I got on the job, I hit the ground running, and I thoroughly enjoy my job. With the Richmond Police Department, I think there's a lot to be said about loyalty. There's been a lot of ups and downs through the years. There's a number of years that, fortunately, weren't afforded a pay raise. Because the Richmond Police Department took the opportunity and gave me the shot, I stayed with them. So I would think that loyalty and paying back the opportunities you were afforded is important.
The captain's actually second generation. I actually worked with his dad because his dad was with another agency.
Tom, you're just throwing your age out there, my man.
Right.
Experience.
And we've got
Experience.
And it's amazing how many second generation officers we have on the department.
Yeah, I think if you walk in our the lobby, we've
in the past and currently, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Which is good. My youngest actually chose to go to the fire department, and of course there's that healthy between the two, but I'm equally as proud of him because he's again serving his community, and again he and I thought he might go into law enforcement, but it just so happened that his high school girlfriend, which is now his wife, her dad is actually a firefighter. And, something that the fire department for years offered that law enforcement did not was their program where they can take the high school students in and start, teaching them. And again, that's what we've tried to kind of duplicate a little bit with the cadet program. And I think there's some other things, discussions about trying to get us more involved. I know that I think it's 2027, 28, I'm not sure exactly the year, but all high school students that are graduating have to get some level of seal to graduate. So they're going to be doing internships. That in itself for us as an agency, it's a whole nother responsibility, because if we have young adults that are thinking about coming into this profession, especially our local kids, we want to bring them in and embrace that, get them to stay within our community. I'd love to have them at RPD, but if they end up at the Sheriff's Department or Hagerstown, Centerville, Cambridge, any of those other agencies, it's good that we can, do that. And I know we've had some discussions about trying to grow that cadet program and that internship into something that is a better vessel, so we can, get those next level of officers into the agency. For me, again, I talked about my hobby, my family, and we do a lot of side-by-side, ATV riding. I've got 2 grandbabies in the last couple months that's now kind of I won't call it a hobby, but where my passion is. We get to try to spend as much time with him as we can. Obviously, my retirement's on the horizon in 2029, and I still want to give as much as I can in whatever capacity that I can to the department, to the people I work with. And, we know this from, the bond and the brother and sisterhood. I mean, it's a dysfunctional family at times. But, we've got our times that we come together, and I wish it would be more like that at times. And then we've got our times that we're, maybe, having, conversations in the hallway and things. But we've got, and I said this in the last episode, we've got a lot of good officers on our department that truly are just good humans, good individuals, that love what they do. They love the community. And I'm proud of the people I've worked with. Former and still do. But, one funny story that kind of pops into my mind, and I can't give probably a lot of details. I know that maybe a couple of you were on this call out, but we got a call out on a double homicide on the west side of town. And I was assisting with processing the crime scene. We had a couple victims that were lying on a porch. And were you there that night?
No, I know the story.
You know my story.
Yeah.
I don't know if Tom's heard the story, but we get there and we're examining the crime scene. I'll try to give the short version, and I'm taking some photographs. And there was it's kind of like a double, so the house is split in half. So you've got one side and the other side, and you got a railing in between. Well, the victims were on this side, and based on the scene itself, I really couldn't get over on that side. At least I wasn't going to start there. And as I'm taking photographs, I'm on the other half of the porch. And as I'm taking photographs, I kind of lean over the rail a little bit to get a close photograph. And of course, the two victims are deceased at this point. And all of a sudden, I just see this slight movement out of the head. And I kind of step back. I'm like, did that head just move? We all kind of know what things that the body can do after, it's deceased, rigor and things of that nature. But this was still so early for that. I was like, yeah, wait, I'm seeing things. Maybe it was my vision, the camera. So again, I start taking another photo, and I kind of do the same thing again, and I see this slight movement. I was like, wait a minute, I just saw that move. So eventually, after the third time, I figured out what I was doing, and I'll jump forward to what I did. I had somebody else come up. I'm like, hey, tell me if, take a good look at that person. And they also step up, and the head goes and moves. They're like, what? I'm like, dude, I know. I'm seeing the same thing. And what it was, because we were on the porch, there was a deck board that ran the whole length of the porch. And every time I stepped forward on that board, the victim's head was underneath the board, and it was just causing it to slightly move. Yeah, so once I figured it out, of course, I hate to say it, but I was like, yeah.
Not a zombie.
Yeah. But then again, no one else had figured it out at that point. So I kind of had to have a couple other people come up and look, and I'd step on the board. I'm like, this does it.
And that's a highly trained investigator right there.
Yeah. With a good sense of humor.
Yeah.
And again, we talk about that. It's like, how for all of us, it's been doing this for a while. And, Neil said it earlier, we see and deal with so much. From, the infant deaths all the way up to, other things. And it's like, how can you, keep your insanity after 40 some years, and again, I think it's, our drive, it's our bond, it's our outside family, it's our hobbies, and again, I appreciate you guys. I appreciate the job that you do. I know that, I hope the community sees who you are as individuals and the passion that you have, and again, and appreciate the service. Tom, and I know that Detective Mark Sutton's obviously going to be retiring in a couple months as well, or less. But again, it's this profession is very unique. We know that it takes very unique individuals. So again, I guess we'll wrap things up. I appreciate you guys being here. The next podcast, we're anticipating on have our safe unit on, and I appreciate you guys tuning in. Again, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to make those. If there's something that you feel like you want to have a further in-depth conversation about, particularly Detective Van Middlesworth, about some of that technology with the apps for kids, we're here as a resource. Reach out. We don't mind. Actually, we prefer to have those conversations. And again, if there's something that you want to discuss about the podcast, things that you might like to see or things you like or don't like. I'm available. Take those calls. You can call me at the police department at 765-983-7376. Again, that'll go to my desk. If I'm not there to answer it, I'm happy to call you back. But we want to continue to do this. Again, we're going to move through our agency and our civilian staff, get our dispatchers on here, maybe even other first responders to come on, our fire guys, let them talk a little bit about what they do. Again, this is just something that we want to do to make our community more aware of what we do and answer questions, have that transparency. And again, it's part of that community engagement initiative that we've taken on to, navigate, some of this stuff that we see as law enforcement and be part of the community. So I appreciate you guys tuning in. Thumbs up. We'll see you next episode.